Let's start out with Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 11. Title of the sermon is Lowly and on a Donkey. And let's start with our text first, verse 1. Now when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, and saying to them, Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, The Lord needs them, and he will send for them at once. And this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. And the disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and the others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, Who is this? And the crowds said, This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. I've brought this up before. Now, you guys know how we do it here. We exposit the text. We pick a book of the Bible, and then we exposit every pericope in that book. There's a fancy term. I didn't realize there was actually a term for this, but it's called pericopal theology. Pericopal theology. Every pericope in the Bible has a unique theology, something we learn about God, something we learn about holiness, righteousness, blameless. And so we look at each pericope and we try to decide that. And you just, you're never really in control of what pericope falls on which Sunday. But as you guys have noticed, a lot of times, even though we just go straight through the book, a lot of times the pericope from that we're on that happens to correspond to something that's going on at that moment in time. I don't know if you can call that a small miracle, or if you want to just call it coincidence. I don't think it's coincidence. And so what's interesting to me today, and this was not planned at all until my mother made me aware of this, we're talking about Jesus coming into Jerusalem on the donkey when they put palm branches down before him. And does anybody know what today is? Palm Sunday. This just, I don't know what you make of that. Miraculous or coincidence? But that's our pericope, and today happens to be Palm Sunday. If you're not that familiar with it, Palm Sunday is, I don't know if it's a holiday, but it's something that's on the calendar. And that marks the week beginning when Jesus enters Jerusalem, and it will be 1 week, if not 6 days, before his passion happens. And so that begins being observed today, Saturday, Palm Sunday. We want to observe something, and I want to pick up just a little bit from last week's sermon. Last week we saw Jesus was in Jericho, and we made a note that Matthew has been letting us know in little phrases the journey from way up north all the way into Jerusalem. Last week, Jesus was in Jericho. He was surrounded by crowds of people, and he was showing compassion to people that needed his attention. We saw the 2 blind men, that Jesus showed compassion and grace and gentleness. And so he's traveling from Jericho, and he's in today's text, he's arriving at the Mount of Olives, Bethphage, which is about a mile or 2 outside of the city, but he's arriving at the Mount of Olives. I should just draw your attention that a lot of the text today, you need to know the Old Testament references to King David in order to recognize what's happening in the text today. If we're unfamiliar, then we will miss it. So let me go ahead and give you one that we've already passed up. Jesus comes from Jericho to the Mount of Olives, and on the Mount of Olives, 2 donkeys are brought to him. Well, when Absalom, one of David's sons, took over Jerusalem, David had to flee out of Jerusalem, and he flees, but when things are better, David comes back to Jerusalem, and you would think that David would come back to Jerusalem angry and ready to kill his enemies, but that's not the way he comes back to Jerusalem. So the biblical story says that David came through a place called Gilgal. And you might just miss this, but Gilgal is on the edge of Jericho. All of Jerusalem went out to meet David, and David rode from Gilgal, Jericho, all the way. David came all the way from Jericho to the Mount of Olives, with all Jerusalem accompanying him and following him into the city. And isn't that what we're going to see today? What we started last week. All of Jerusalem and all the pilgrims were starting out in Jericho with Jesus, and they are following him all the way into Jerusalem. That begins to frame the picture of what's going on. I'm going to give you one sermon topic, one thing to watch for. What Davidic scene is a typology of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem? Just as important as Jesus doing what he's about to do is to know that it's already been done once before. And that's the connection that we want to make. What Davidic scene is a typology of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. So let's go forward. The next break of text. Then Jesus sent 2 disciples, and he said to them, "Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me." And I'm going to jump down to verse 6 here. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. And they brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. Already, a Jewish reader that was familiar with the Old Testament would have already begun to pick up on things that were signposts, that were trigger warnings to say, pay attention, guys. Pay attention, because something very important is happening right now. Jesus is deliberately being provocative in the text that we just read. Jesus is deliberately going out of his way to duplicate something that had already happened historically. And he is doing this to get everybody's attention. So there are a few things. Let me kind of outline a couple things for you. The first thing is Matthew's gospel doesn't tell us this, but Mark tells us that this colt that they brought to Jesus, along with the mother donkey, the colt had never been ridden before. Now, that's a key word throughout the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament, whenever something was going to be inaugurated that was spiritual or holy or divine, something that had a divine transcendent significance, it was always inaugurated or kicked off with an animal or an item that had never been used before. Let me remind you of a couple things. When Moses was doing something with the tabernacle, in order to inaugurate that moment, this is Numbers 19, he says, "Tell the people of Israel to bring you a red heifer without defect, without blemish, on which a yoke had never been laid." So an animal that had never ever had to do work is going to inaugurate this event. Again, 1 Samuel chapter 6, when David goes to bring the Ark of the Covenant back, he had to make a special inaugural way to usher in the Ark of the Covenant. And he says, "I want you to do two things. I want you to get a cow that's never been yoked, and I want you to make a cart that's never been used." So these are inaugural things. These are things that draw your attention that something very, very important and significant is about to happen. And so when Jesus requires that they bring him a donkey that had never been ridden, that's clue number one. This is going to be a momentous event. What Jesus is about to do is going to be a momentous event. It's going to have tremendous significance. And the second significant thing is we've already seen how Jesus' journey from Jericho to Jerusalem with all of Israel accompanying him. We've already seen that that's exactly what David did when Absalom had been killed and David comes back. All of Jerusalem went to Jericho and accompanied David back into Jerusalem. Well, now we see another significance. Jesus asks to have 2 donkeys brought to him. Let me take you to 2 Samuel 15. When David had passed a little beyond the summit, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a couple of donkeys. In the text, when you look at the text, all of what Jesus is about to do is going to mimic what David had already done with Absalom in 2 Samuel chapters 15 through 20. That's going to be our reference for the sermon. And that's the section of text that we have to be familiar with in order to recognize the significance of what Jesus is doing. So when it says David passed a little beyond the summit, that summit happens to be the Mount of Olives as he was returning to Jerusalem. And on the summit, on the Mount of Olives, 2 donkeys were being brought to him. And that's exactly what Jesus wants to make clear, exactly what Jesus asks for. Have 2 donkeys brought to me as I wait here on the mountain. Jesus, up to this point, had concealed himself. When he healed people, he said, "Make sure you don't tell anybody. Make sure you don't tell anybody. Keep this a secret." Jesus didn't want his kingship to be revealed to anybody, probably because the people would have taken him by force and wanted to make him king, or they would have taken him prisoner early on. So he wanted his messiahship, his kingship, to be kept on the down low. But right now, we should know that with party streamers are falling out of the sky, metaphorically, he is letting you know the Messiah King has come. And you should recognize him because he is doing exactly what his father, King David, did. Because the new Messiah King was going to follow in the steps of David. And that's exactly what Jesus is making clear here. One of the commentaries said, the time of concealment is over. You can't have a huge throng of people following you all the way from Jericho and then get on 2 donkeys without people recognizing that's what David did. This is a replay, an instant replay of what happened centuries ago. Huge crowds went out to receive David just as they did Jesus. Let me take you to 2 Samuel 18 and verse 15. And so the king came back to the Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to meet the king and to bring the king over the Jordan. Put a square around Gilgal there and put Jericho. Gilgal is right on the outside edge of Jericho. So all the people went out to meet David in Jericho, and now they're all bringing him over the Jordan, and they're all following him back to Jerusalem. 2 Samuel chapter 20, we see it again, but in more fuller detail. 2 Samuel 20 and verse 2. But the men of Judah followed their king steadfastly from the Jordan to Jerusalem. And then David came to his house at Jerusalem. All of these events are Jesus' connection to King David. And last week's pericope, we saw the blind men were saying, Son of David, Son of David. So the text has been preparing us to witness the Son of David, the Messianic king like David, because the scriptures had told Israel, this will be your sign. Let's read it. Back to our text, verse 4. All of this took place to fulfill what was spoken of by the prophet, saying, Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, your king is coming to you, gentle and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. Now, let me pause for just a minute here. If the first century readers weren't familiar with David and Absalom's story and all of the imagery of David coming back into Jerusalem, accompanied by the crowds, on a donkey, gentle and merciful, he wasn't coming to destroy the Israelites that rejected him. David returned into Jerusalem gentle and merciful. Now, that's the whole focus of the story. That's what we need to know. For people that didn't recognize that, you would recognize that what's being described here is called a triumph. First century Greco-Roman culture, even further back than that, Julius Caesar. But a triumph is what Rome did when a king came into his city victorious, having destroyed enemies. But a triumph was a big, pompous display of power and awe. This king is not coming in power and awe and victory. He's coming gentle and meek and on a donkey. So the picture would make no sense, because that's not what a triumph looks like. Let me show you a couple triumphs. Way back in 46, Julius Caesar. After conquering, Julius Caesar has a triumph. That was a Roman Greco thing. A triumph is when a king comes back into his city, triumphant, victorious. He brings all the slaves that he has captured. He brings all of the spoils of war, the wealth and the gold that he's brought in. And he comes in a massive display of power and force. Julius Caesar came in. Now, there's a guy riding a horse, one of the 4 horses. Ignore that guy riding the horse. The guy you want to look at is the guy in the back standing up in the chariot. Julius Caesar came in a gold-covered chariot with a man holding a wreath of victory over his head. Julius Caesar painted his face red in order to honor the god Jupiter for giving him victory. And that's a 4-horse chariot. A 4-horse chariot was the envy of the world at that time. That was the marvel of the war machine in those days. A 4-horse chariot. So that is what a triumph looks like. Arrogant, boastful, accompanied with your army and with your weapons and with the spoils of war. We get another image of this in case we're wondering, well, that's Julius Caesar, Rome. Does that apply to David's day? Well, what did Absalom do when Absalom ran David out of Jerusalem and Absalom took over as king? Let me read it to you. After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses, and 50 men to run before him. Absalom wanted to display his power and authority. Absalom went in and raped his father's concubines to show all of Jerusalem, I'm the top dog, I'm the man, I'm the new tyrant in town. He paraded around town in a show of power and fierceness, and he wanted a chariot and horses, because that's what you do when you're a bad king. That's what you do when you're a tyrant. And that's exactly what Absalom wanted to look like. Power and defiance, top dog mentality. And what we need to do with that part of the story is we need to recognize that Absalom is a type. Absalom's value system reflects the values of the world at that time. So Absalom is a type of worldly leaders. Absalom represents wicked rebellion against God. Absalom is the type of a godless, lawless, tyrannical, oriental leader, and they like to ride in pomp and power and arrogance and tyranny. But David, we're going to see in the story, David, when Absalom is killed, and now Israel makes a realization that they have allied themselves to the wrong person. Absalom is killed, the proper, true king of Jerusalem, God's king, comes back. But how does he come back? And the text says he comes back lowly and gentle, riding on a donkey. The reason nobody would recognize what this is because this is not the way worldly kings come into their kingdom. But this is exactly how God's king comes into his kingdom. Because God's king God is the one that is fighting his battles for him. God is the one that won David's battle for him. So the king could be gentle and meek and lowly. And that is what the future messianic king, the Bible tells us, that's what the future messianic king will look like when God sends him. So in the text that we just read, lowly and on a donkey, he's quoting Zechariah 9:9. So let me take you to that text, because it's got to be that text that clues us in as to what's going on here. So Zechariah 9:9, he says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on the foal of a donkey." What is that text saying? Zechariah and Haggai were two prophets that wrote about the same time. Zechariah and Haggai, after Israel comes back from Babylonian captivity, and they're allowed to return to Jerusalem and to start to rebuild Jerusalem. And we read they start to rebuild the wall. They want to rebuild the temple, but there's all kinds of problems. They can't get the work done because some people don't want to work. Some people are coming. Some of the little neighboring people are pestering Israel. And the Bible says they had to build the wall with one hand and carry a sword with the other hand. And so Zechariah and Haggai teach Israel at a time where they're supposed to be feeling success. We're back in Jerusalem. We're free. We've been told that we can rebuild the wall and rebuild the temple, but there's all kinds of difficulty and complications, and they can't get anything done. And so Zechariah writes them, and in chapters 9 through 14 of Zechariah is giving them hope. The purpose of Zechariah 9 through 14 is to encourage a discouraged people because they're trying to rebuild, but there's all kinds of obstacles and things aren't getting done. So Zechariah uses this text to encourage discouraged Israelites. And Zechariah 9, 1 through 8, what Zechariah does is he reminds them of all of their enemies that are no longer around anymore. The Philistines, Tyre, all of the people who in Israel's past oppressed them and were a bane to them. And that's how Zechariah starts chapter 9, is reminding them, remember all these people, all the people that were the bane of your existence? And fundamentally, he says, where are they now? What he's trying to remind Israel is that you have some oppression happening right now, but haven't you had oppression in the past? And hasn't God rescued you in the past? Hasn't God killed your enemies in the past? So he's trying to encourage them, God can intercede. And then another aspect of their past that he reminds them of is, remember when even David got kicked out. Even David experienced obstacles and opposition. Remember David's story. But at the end of that story, what happened? He says, God destroys Absalom. And then David, the king, who had experienced oppression for a little while, he comes back home. Not only does David come home, but David comes home with all of Jerusalem accompanying him all the way from Jericho, all the way home, riding on a donkey, and they welcome him home. And David comes home not angry at Jerusalem for having turned on him. David's whole trip home in the text, 2 Samuel 15 through 20. In the text, when the people go out, they're all begging David for mercy and forgiveness. We're sorry we turned on you. We're sorry we did this. We're sorry we allied with your son. And the whole way back to Jerusalem, David is being merciful and gentle. David doesn't come home angry. David comes home showing mercy and gentleness on the whole trip back. And when he comes into Jerusalem, the first thing David does is he cries. David cries because they've killed his son Absalom, his enemy. And what Zechariah verse 9 and 10 does is it reminds these people, do you remember when you had a king like that? You remember when you had a merciful, gracious king that would forgive and mourn the death of his enemies? And Zechariah says, God is going to send you that again. Zechariah is an encouraging. You're going to see that same type of king again one day. And that's what Matthew is recording for us. Jesus is coming back to Jerusalem as the Messianic king that Zechariah promised would one day come. And he would come and he would be merciful and he would be gentle and he would cry over Jerusalem and he would forgive his enemies. That's the picture that we're supposed to see. So the encouragement for Israel in the days of Zechariah is, when you see a branch from the tribe of Judah, when you see someone coming from Jericho with throngs of Jews following him, when you see someone riding on a donkey, 2 donkeys coming, when you see a king that comes into Jerusalem with gentleness and compassion, full of mercy, that will be God's Messianic king. That's the guy that we're waiting for. Let me give you a quote on this section of Scripture. Any Jewish reader of the story could hardly fail to be reminded of it and of the royal ideology which underlies what Jesus is doing in the story. Zechariah's prophecy of a humble and peaceful king coming to Jerusalem, vindicated and saved, is based on the story of David's return to the city after the defeat of Absalom's rebellion, when he came in triumph as a king, yet humbly and in peace. When the son of David, he's speaking about Jesus here, when the son of David chose to ride down to the city from the Mount of Olives on a donkey, the acted allusion was unmistakable. Your king is here. That's really what you want to take back. So, what Davidic scene is Jesus acting out? And the answer to that would be 2 Samuel chapters 15 through 20. David coming back into Jerusalem after Absalom has been killed. Put a pin in the sermon right there, guys, because that's Zechariah 9. And it's beautiful and miraculous. You know, Israel, the Jews, and many Protestants are still waiting for Israel to be rebuilt, for Jesus to come over the Mount of Olives. But here's the problem. They're waiting for him to come destroy his enemies. That's the vision that they have of king, of their messianic king. The Jews' messianic king is going to come riding over the Mount of Olives, but he's going to kill people. That's who the Jews are waiting for right now. But plainly, the text says, no, that's a worldly king. You're looking for another Absalom. God doesn't work that way. God's not going to send you a worldly king, another tyrant. God is going to send you a messianic king, and here's how you can recognize him. That's what our text tells us today. So, it's an amazing fulfillment of Scripture to me for Jesus to have reenacted all of that. And to wonder that everybody recognized, they must have recognized what was happening. Because they were yelling, Hosanna, son of David. We recognize you. You're finally here. So let's put a pin in the sermon right there, because Zechariah, that's Zechariah's word of encouragement to Israel at a time when they were trying to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple, and they were discouraged and nothing was happening. But he doesn't just stop there with this messianic image. I want to quickly take you through one verse in each of the rest of the chapters of Zechariah. So we looked at Zechariah 9. Let me give you a verse from Zechariah 10. Zechariah 10 and verse 2. For the household gods utter nonsense, and the diviners, they see lies. They tell false dreams. They give empty consolation. Therefore, the people wander like sheep. They are afflicted for lack of a shepherd. My anger is hot against the shepherds, and I will punish the shepherds, for the Lord of hosts cares for his flock, for the house of Judah. Now there is destruction here. Somebody is angry, and somebody is going to destroy the shepherds that have not been doing their work. Someone is going to destroy the shepherds that reject the Messianic King. And that's God speaking here. That's why Jesus is able to ride into Jerusalem gentle and merciful, because he doesn't need to kill anybody. Because in Zechariah 10, we see God is the one who will be coming to destroy enemies. Zechariah 11 and verse 12. Progressing through Zechariah. Then I said to them, if it seems good to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. And then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and I threw it into the house of the Lord. Zechariah 11 says, they're not going to value my servant. He's only going to be worth 30 pieces of silver to them. Zechariah chapter 12. Verse 10, and I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. Zechariah 12 says Jerusalem is going to be filled with great regret, because they're only going to realize who their Messianic King is after they've pierced him. Zechariah chapter 13. On that day there will be a fountain open for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to cleanse them from sin and uncleanliness. Scripture says Jesus bought us with his blood. He redeemed us. He ransomed us. And Zechariah says, look forward to that day, because in that day there will be forgiveness of sins. Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 21. And there will no longer be a Canaanite. More accurately, the word should be merchant. There will no longer be a merchant in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. There's not going to be people in the temple, profaning the temple, being in the house of God, selling things anymore after that day. Does anybody know why? Well, that's going to be next week's sermon. This gentle king is going to make a cord of whips, and he's going to run all of the merchants, all of the traders, all of the people who are having a flea market in God's house. He's going to run them all out. He's going to cleanse the temple. Jesus will run the riffraff out of the temple. So that's all the hope that Zechariah gave. That was a little extra than the sermon. Little extra notes. Zechariah 9 through 14. Even though we're only focusing on 9 today. Someone's going to come who will run all the riffraff out of the temple. And we have the glorious joy of being able to look back on these things and go, wow, Jesus fulfilled all of those prophecies. What a miraculous story. Let me give you the last verse in our text today. Verse 10. Sorry, this was supposed to be climactic and I already gave away the punchline. Let me rewind a little bit. So who is this guy going to be? Zechariah chapter 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14 is describing someone who's coming. Who is it going to be? Will we recognize him? Well, that's where we come back to our text, verse 10. Matthew 21 and verse 10. And then he entered Jerusalem, and the whole city was stirred up, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowd said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." Who fulfills the messianic expectation? Who is the branch of the tribe of Judah? Who is the son of David? Who is this gentle king that will ride into town and forgive the sins of men? All Israel wanted to know, who is this guy? His name is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth.